Dawn was still hidden behind a wall of cold gray fog when the German officers began to feel something was wrong. The date was October 6th, 1941, somewhere west of the Soviet city of Bryansk. The ground was wet from autumn rain. The air smelled of mud, oil, and smoke. German soldiers stood beside their tanks, waiting for orders to move forward. They believed the campaign was almost over. For months, the Wehrmacht had pushed deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union. Cities had fallen quickly. Soviet armies had collapsed again and again. German commanders were already speaking about victory. Moscow, they believed, was only weeks away. But that morning, as engines idled quietly in the fog, a strange sound rolled across the fields.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
It was deep, heavy, and unfamiliar. At first, the German tank crews thought it might be thunder. Then the ground began to vibrate. Operation Barbarossa had begun just 3 months earlier, on June 22nd, 1941. It was the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. They were supported by over 3,000 tanks and thousands of aircraft. Adolf Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of weeks. German intelligence reports claimed the Red Army was poorly trained, badly led, and weak. Many German generals believed the same thing. Early victories seemed to prove them right. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched west. German armored spearheads moved fast across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The Blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed France the year before seemed unstoppable. German panzer divisions moved like lightning across the wide Soviet plains. Tanks such as the Panzer III and Panzer IV led the attacks. They were supported by motorized infantry and Stuka dive bombers screaming down from the sky. Soviet defenses often collapsed quickly under these attacks. Many Soviet tanks were old models like the T-26 or BT-7, lightly armored and poorly coordinated. German tank crews learned to destroy them with ease. Confidence inside the Wehrmacht grew with every victory. By late summer, many German officers were convinced the Soviet Union was close to defeat. But deep inside Soviet factories and design bureaus, something very different had been happening. Years before the war began, Soviet engineers had been working on a new kind of tank. They wanted something fast, powerful, and heavily armored. One of the key men behind this effort was Mikhail Koshkin, a Soviet engineer working in Kharkiv. His team designed a machine that would soon change the war completely. It was called the T-34. When the T-34 first appeared in 1940, even many Soviet officers did not fully understand how revolutionary it was. The tank used sloped armor, which made it much harder for enemy shells to penetrate. Its 76.2-millimeter gun was stronger than most tank guns at the time. The wide tracks allowed it to move through mud and snow much better than German tanks. It also used a powerful V2 diesel engine, which reduced the risk of fire. In theory, the T-34 was exactly what the Red Army needed. But in 1941, only a limited number were available, and many crews were still learning how to use them. Back on the battlefield near Bryansk, German troops were preparing for another advance toward Moscow. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had launched a massive new offensive called Operation Typhoon on October 2nd, 1941. The goal was simple: capture Moscow before winter. German commanders believed the Soviet army was already collapsing. If Moscow fell, the war might end. German armored units pushed forward through forests and open fields, but the weather had begun to change. Autumn rain turned roads into thick mud. Vehicles struggled to move. Supply trucks became stuck. Tanks burned more fuel trying to cross the sticky ground. Soldiers were cold and tired, but most still believed victory was near. That morning near Bryansk, a column of German tanks from the 4th Panzer Division waited in formation. Many of the crews were veterans. They had fought in Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. They trusted their machines and their commanders. The Panzer III, with its 50-millimeter gun, had been reliable in earlier battles. Against older Soviet tanks, it performed well. German crews believed it would perform well again, but as the fog rolled slowly across the fields, the distant rumble grew louder. A German tank commander named Oberleutnant Hans Becker peered through his binoculars. Visibility was poor. Shapes moved in the distance, dark silhouettes pushing through the mist. At first he thought they were tractors or trucks. Then the fog shifted for a moment, and the shape became clear. It was a tank, but not one he recognized. The vehicle looked larger than the Soviet tanks they had faced before. Its turret had strange angles. The armor plates were sloped sharply. The tracks were wide, chewing through the muddy ground without slowing down. Another shape appeared behind it, then another. Soon, several of them were moving forward through the fog. These were T-34 tanks. German commanders had heard rumors about new Soviet armor, but few had seen them in action. Now they were appearing right in front of the panzer formations. German tank guns opened fire first. A Panzer III fired its 50-millimeter gun. The shell struck the front armor of the approaching T-34 and bounced away. The German crew stared in disbelief. Another shot followed. Again, the shell ricocheted off the sloped armor. The T-34 did not stop. Instead, its turret slowly turned toward the German tanks. Inside the Soviet vehicle, the crew worked quickly. The commander shouted orders. The gunner aimed carefully. When the 76-millimeter gun fired, the sound echoed across the foggy field like a thunderclap. The shell struck a German Panzer III at close range. The explosion tore through the thin armor. Within seconds, the battlefield turned into chaos. German tanks tried to reposition, searching for weak spots. Some crews aimed for the sides of the T-34, hoping the armor there would be thinner. But the Soviet tanks moved quickly, advancing through mud that slowed the German machines. Many German shells simply bounced off. German commanders quickly realized they had a serious problem. Their standard anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate the new Soviet armor. Even the Panzer IV, with its short-barreled 75-millimeter gun, had difficulty destroying the T-34 from the front. Reports of these encounters spread quickly through the German ranks. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of German armored warfare, soon received alarming messages from the front. German officers described a Soviet tank that was fast, heavily armored, and extremely difficult to destroy. Guderian himself saw the T-34 during battles in the autumn of 1941. He later wrote that the appearance of the T-34 came as an unpleasant surprise. German engineers began examining captured examples whenever possible. What they found shocked them. The sloped armor design made the tank much stronger than its thickness suggested. German shells often deflected instead of penetrating. The wide tracks gave the tank excellent mobility on poor roads. German tanks, with their narrow tracks, struggled in mud and snow. Even worse, the Soviet Union was producing these tanks in large numbers. By late 1941, factories deep inside the Soviet Union were working day and night to build more T-34s. Many factories had been moved east beyond the Ural Mountains to escape German bombing. Entire industrial plants were dismantled and transported by train across thousands of kilometers. Workers reassembled them in harsh conditions in cities like Chelyabinsk, which later became known as Tankograd. Despite freezing temperatures and shortages of materials, Soviet workers kept production moving. Meanwhile, the fighting near Moscow grew more desperate. By November 1941, German forces had advanced close enough to see the distant outlines of the city through binoculars. Some German patrols were less than 30 kilometers away. But winter was arriving. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. German soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Engines froze during the night. Weapons malfunctioned in the extreme cold. The Red Army, however, began launching counterattacks. Fresh Soviet units arrived from Siberia. These troops were trained for winter warfare. Many of them were supported by T-34 tanks. Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov, recently appointed to defend Moscow, reorganized the defensive lines and prepared a massive counterattack. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet winter counteroffensive began. Red Army forces struck along a wide front around Moscow. German troops, already exhausted and freezing, suddenly faced powerful attacks. T-34 tanks played a major role in these battles. Their wide tracks allowed them to move across deep snow. Their diesel engines performed better in cold temperatures than many German machines. Soviet tank units pushed into German positions, forcing surprised defenders to retreat. German commanders struggled to respond. Anti-tank guns like the 37mm Pak-36 were almost useless against the T-34. German soldiers gave the weapon a bitter nickname, the door knocker, because its shells often bounced harmlessly off enemy armor. Stronger weapons, such as the famous 88mm Flak gun, could destroy T-34s, but these guns were heavy and not always available in the right place. Many had originally been designed for anti-aircraft defense, yet they now became one of the few reliable weapons capable of penetrating Soviet armor at long range. For the first time since the invasion began, German forces were pushed backward in large numbers. The myth of an easy victory in the Soviet Union was collapsing. As winter tightened its grip on the battlefield, German units fell back from positions they had fought hard to capture. The Red Army regained territory around Moscow. Although the war was far from over, the German advance had been stopped. Inside German headquarters, the reports continued to arrive. Officers described encounters with Soviet tanks that appeared suddenly out of forests or snowstorms. German infantry units reported entire armored formations attacking with speed and determination. Many soldiers began to realize that the enemy they had been told was weak had far greater strength than expected. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders learned from the early disasters of the invasion. Tank crews received better training. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor slowly improved. The T-34 was not perfect. Early models had poor radios and cramped turrets. Some mechanical parts failed under heavy use. But the design was strong, and Soviet engineers constantly improved it. By 1942, production of the T-34 increased dramatically. Factories produced thousands of them every year. Many were rushed directly from factories to the front lines. Crews sometimes received only brief training before entering combat. Yet even with these challenges, the T-34 remained one of the most effective tanks on the battlefield. German engineers urgently began working on new tank designs that could match it. One result of this effort would be the Panther tank, introduced later in the war. The Panther used sloped armor and a powerful long-barreled gun capable of destroying a T-34 at long range. German designers also improved the Panzer IV by installing a longer 75mm gun to better fight Soviet armor. But in the winter of 1941, those new machines were still far in the future. On the frozen fields around Moscow, the T-34 had already proven itself. German soldiers who had once believed the Soviet army was weak now understood something very different. The Red Army was learning, adapting, and building powerful weapons faster than the Germans had predicted. Many German veterans later remembered the first time they saw the T-34. They described the shock of watching shells bounce off its armor, the fear of facing a tank that seemed almost unstoppable, the moment when confidence turned into uncertainty. For the men fighting inside those steel machines, the experience was intense and terrifying. Tank crews operated in tight spaces filled with heat, smoke, and the constant smell of fuel. Every hit against the armor could be deadly. Yet both sides continued to fight with determination as the war grew larger and more brutal. The fog that morning near Bryansk had hidden more than just a few Soviet tanks. It had hidden the first clear sign that the war in the East would not be short. It would become the largest and most brutal conflict in human history. And rolling out of that cold gray fog was the machine that changed everything, the Soviet T-34.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.